So this right here is the OM-3. OM System released this camera back in February of this year, and although I'm primarily a Fuji user, this camera did catch my attention for a couple of reasons. For one, I saw some of the work that people were making with it, and I saw some potential for this camera to fit really well into my street photography workflow. So that's why when OM System offered me an opportunity to try this camera out, I thought it would be a fun opportunity. I've gotten to test out pretty much all of the photo features on the camera. I found myself using it to also gather B-roll. That said, in this video, I want to give a rundown of my experience with the OM-3 so far, give some thoughts on the things that I like about it, as well as point out a few things that I'd like to see change if they did a future update of this camera, a future release of some kind. Just to be transparent, OM System did sponsor this video, and they reviewed my script prior to recording just to ensure accuracy of any technical details or any explanations of features, things like that. But outside of that, they're allowing me to share my experience with this camera honestly as I walk through some of the features and just give you, again, my thoughts on the camera. But with that out of the way, first thing I want to talk a little bit about is the design of the OM-3. The most obvious thing that we can note about this camera is it's small. Even with a lens on it, especially with a prime lens, it's tiny, easily fits into small sling bags, compartments of camera bags. The build quality is pretty solid. It's got a mix of plastic and metal. On the back of the camera, you have this protrusion where you can fix your thumb so you can actually grip the camera while you're walking around. You have a fully articulating screen that you can turn out toward your subject or potentially yourself if you're, vlogging with it or maybe doing A-roll, for example. You have an autofocus button on the back, which personally I used a lot just because I prefer back button focus. And on the back, you also have buttons for menu access, playback, and other features. Now across the top, you're gonna find an on-off switch. You'll find a dial that switches us from stills to movie, as well as offers this S and Q mode, which I'm not gonna get too far into. You have another dial for all the various shooting modes in general. Personally, I just sit in either manual or aperture priority for the most part. You have your aperture dial and the shutter button built right into the top of it. You have a dedicated shutter speed dial and other buttons across the top for some other functions as well. On the front of the camera, you'll find the new creative dial, which we will dedicate a section of this video to talking about, so you'll hear more about that. Now, just as a whole, again, if we back out and just look at this design, I'm always a fan of a film feeling digital camera. Now, in terms of specs and capabilities, it has a 20 megapixel stack sensor, an IP53 weather and dust seal rating, 5-axis IBIS, a computational photo mode button on the body for things like HDR, live ND, focus stacking, and a bunch of other stuff. We've got multiple autofocus modes that span across the entire sensor and impressive video specs, including 4K 60 frames per second in 10 bits and a log profile. So in terms of capability, I'd argue that even with this being a micro four thirds sensor camera, it's definitely got workhorse potential for sure. Now, I think a lot of people aren't going to be sure what to expect from a micro four thirds camera, but with a 20 megapixel sensor, I've personally found the camera gives you more than enough resolution to play with, and it also offers two different high-res modes, one of which offers 50 megapixel images handheld and up to 80 megapixels when you're shooting on a tripod. But just to back up, even shooting at 20 megapixels, I found the files to be really clean. They're sharp, they're detailed, and they definitely carry a lot of data so you can play around with your files in post if you're shooting raw. I personally don't worry as much about the resolution, but I do care a lot more about dynamic range and color. If you've seen my work before, you may see that I've gotten pretty specific with my editing style over the last couple of years. So with any new camera, I'm always asking, can I get my look with these files? And with this camera, I was not disappointed in the slightest. The camera has close to 13 stops of dynamic range, and in my experience with the files, you've got more than enough flexibility even in high contrast, punchy scenes. So you're able to pull back those highlights, bring up those shadows, all that good stuff. The OM-3 introduces a new feature, the creative dial alongside creative color profiles. It's basically like editing your photos in camera. If I had to summarize it, you end up with a JPEG that has a creative look baked into the image. There's no editing required. Now, I normally shoot RAW so that I can edit my photos later, but with this camera, I shot in both RAW and JPEG so I could try out the different looks. Personally, the way that I approached it was I kept the creative dial mostly in the color selection, and then I would just make subtle adjustments from there based on the scene that I was in front of. So for example, a punchy backlit scene, I generally reduced the contrast of the image a little bit and just tweaked the curve to recover some highlight detail as well as some shadow detail. And as for colors, I just just worked on it based on whatever scene I was in front of and what time of day it was and what the lighting looked like. I would just go through each color and, you know, either bump or reduce the saturation based on what I thought kind of looked good for that scene. And ultimately, again, as this is not an approach that I'm used to, I actually found this to be a pretty engaging way to shoot. So if you have this camera, I would definitely recommend playing around with these modes and seeing what you can come up with. Now, if I had to compare this process to the film simulations that Fujifilm is doing with their cameras, I'd say it's obviously similar in that you get a JPEG that's shareable from both, and the JPEG has a baked look. But the creative color profiles from OM align more with what I would think of as digital processing or digital editing, not necessarily an approach that's aiming to get you a film look or a film inspired look the way that the Fuji film simulations do. As mentioned earlier, this camera also introduces a button dedicated on the back to what they call computational photography modes. When you press and hold this button, you can cycle through these different modes using the front dial. Options include high resolution shot, live ND, graduated ND, HDR, focus stacking. There's a whole bunch in here. To my surprise, by far my favorite mode in this section was actually the HDR mode, and I enjoyed using it specifically on low light scenes that I was shooting with a tripod. Normally I would just bracket manually, meaning I would shoot an even exposure of the scene, and then I would shoot a couple of photos overexposed, a couple of photos underexposed, and I would manually combine those all in Lightroom. But using this HDR mode directly in the camera, I was able to bracket super quickly without having to do it myself. It's not producing a bunch of different raw images for you, it just gives you one image that you can then go and work with in Lightroom. So you basically skip the merge step. And I was more than pleased with the results that I was able to get with that mode. So that's a feature that I would definitely be using quite a bit in the future. Coming from Fujifilm cameras, similar to how I was looking at the sensor size, I wasn't quite sure what to expect when it comes to the video specs of this camera, but I wanted to keep an open mind as I approached this and explored all of the different specs that the camera had to offer. As I mentioned earlier, this thing is actually pretty stacked, especially for a camera this size. You get up to 4K 60 frames per second, 10-bit internal recording. You also have log recording, so you can really dial in the look of your footage later in post. And funny enough, IBIS actually ended up being the biggest standout spec on this camera for me. So the OM-3 has 6 stops of shake reduction and over 7 when the camera is used with specific lenses that have their Sync IS technology. Now that 7 stops matches my current Fuji gear on paper, but to my surprise, even when just playing the footage back on the camera itself, it's buttery smooth, genuinely a lot smoother than I expected. So now this raised a curious, question for me. Why does 7 stops on this camera seem to be more effective than it is on some of my other cameras? And from what I've researched, it seems this is probably due to the sensor side. And this makes a lot of sense when you actually sit down and think about it. IBIS Tech is gonna have a harder time stabilizing a bigger sensor. So the micro 4/3 sensor actually helps get you slightly better stabilization. Now moving on, as for the log footage, this was another area I was really curious about with this camera. The OM Log 400 profile has a base ISO of 400, of course. And as someone that does like to color grade their footage from scratch to get a look that I'm happy with, this profile was something I wanted to make sure I tested out. But as you can see, the log profile performed really well in post-production during color grading. It provided plenty of flexibility for me to take my photos in, a variety of directions and ultimately get, a look that I wanted. Stepping back again from all the granular specs, just overall, I'm not sure I would use this camera for my client work per se or some projects, but as a daily camera to shoot stills and hybridly grab some B-roll while I'm out and about in the city, this thing absolutely holds its own, and honestly on the video side really exceeded my expectations. Now of course with any camera there's always the potential for future improvements. On this camera, one thing I'd love to see some sort of physical control of the ISO setting. If you're shooting in manual, it's nice to have that extra quick control. I did assign the top function function button on the camera to pull up the ISO setting. So I tap that function button and it shows my ISO setting and allows me to change it with the D-pad on the back. That definitely helps, but it still takes a couple of steps. So again, it'd be nice to have some sort of dedicated control for the ISO setting. This point I'm about to raise is more for people that plan to use this for, straight out of camera shooting. They want to just get those JPEGs using the creative color profiles. The changes that you can make to the, looks of your images, the characteristics of your images, they are a little bit limited. So I'd definitely be interested to see how those change in the future. Maybe they'll add the ability to adjust the black or the white point in your image directly, or tweak the hue or luminance of the colors that it allows you to adjust the saturation of, giving you kind of like an in-camera HSL panel, if that makes sense. Also adding the ability to simulate grain on color images. Because I have such a particular style of editing, I still chose to prioritize my RAWs when I was using this camera. Those kind of updates might pull me closer to trusting just the JPEG straight out of camera, as opposed to wanting both the JPEG and the RAW at the same time. After spending some real time with this camera, I was really surprised by how naturally it fit into my workflow, especially on the streets. And of course, there are situations where I would still stick with my main systems, like maybe client work or other projects, but I could definitely see myself using this camera on a daily basis. I think it's underestimated right now as a potential hybrid kit. So if you're shooting a lot of street or you're just traveling a lot and you want a camera that carries a lot of power, something that feels nice to hold, something that's fun to use, and a camera that obviously doesn't weigh you down a ton, this is a camera I'd recommend you do some more research on and check it out. It might be worth adding to your kit. Now that said, that about wraps up everything I have in this one. If you've been thinking about picking up this camera, I'd definitely be interested in hearing your thoughts on some of the points that I raised throughout this video. So let me know down in the comments what you thought as you watch this one. That said, thanks again for watching. Hopefully this video was helpful in some way, and I will see you in my next episode, I guess. Cheers.